Welcome to the CondoVultures.com podcast with your host, Peter Zalewski, a Miami real estate broker, Wall Street consultant, and expert witness. This podcast is focused on identifying real estate buying opportunities in the South Florida condo market of Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. The CondoVultures.com podcast is not authorized by the South Florida real estate industry and will most likely annoy many of the region's talking heads. This podcast will feature straight talk and salty language that could be offensive to some. Please remember that past investment success does not determine future gains, especially in South Florida's volatile condo market. For more information, please visit CondoVultures.com.
Welcome to the Miami Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. If you're tuning into this podcast, you are in luck. You're going to be hearing a conversation between current and former journalists talking about some of the biggest stories that occurred within the last week or so. And the idea of the podcast is to help you, the audience, understand what's kind of really going on in the industry and also give you some context as to why a story might be important or so. What we're going to do for this particular podcast is I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to introduce our three journalists in addition to myself. I was a former journalist. I did it for about 13 years. After that, we will take a short commercial break. We'll then proceed on to our first three stories. We'll take another break. We'll go to another three stories. Now, the idea of these stories is I've handpicked them for a variety of different news sources all around the, let's call it local as well as national platform. And we're going to discuss them. I'll read the headline. I'll read the first couple of graphs, and then I'm going to ask the journalists to go ahead and give us their take on it. Now, we're fortunate enough that one of the journalists that's on the podcast today, he actually wrote two of the six stories that we will be discussing. And then finally, at the end of the podcast, I'm going to ask each of the journalists to go ahead and share some words of wisdom with us. Couple rules of engagement. Keep in mind, if you have any comments for us, if you have any questions, there's something maybe one of our panelists says, please go ahead and send an email to inquiry@condovultures.com. That's INQUIRY@condovultures.com. And if you're listening to this podcast on a traditional platform, such as Apple, such as Google, such as Anchor, and you want to actually watch the podcast, we now have video capability. You can go to any platform that provides for video, such as Spotify. You can also check us out on YouTube, where the handle is Condo Vultures TV. That's Condo Vultures TV. So that being said, let me go ahead and introduce our journalist. Journalist number one, this is one of our regular mainstays on the podcast. He's a gentleman who's been was a journalist for 25 years. Right now, he has a public relations and marketing firm called Gruss Communications. No one else but John Gruss. What's going on, Mr. Gruss?
Hey, Peter. How you doing?
Doing well so far. Doing well. I'm looking forward to this podcast. We got a variety of different stories. We're talking spring break. We're talking banking. And we're also talking about real estate. What else could you ask for, John?
Well, what I really want to know is this podcast authorized by the real estate industry?
Well, I can tell you after posting some stuff on social media about some of the stats I'm seeing, starting to get some pushback. So I would venture to say no, but that's anecdotal. Who else do we have on this podcast? We have a gentleman who was a journalist for over 20 years. He wrote about white collar crime. He wrote about business stories. He actually did a restaurant review. Now he does public relations and consulting. His name is John Fakler. What's going on, Mr. Fakler?
Great to be back, Peter. Just want to correct you there. Didn't write restaurant reviews. I covered the Sun and Fun beat for a while. So that's what at one point in my career, I covered restaurants. So I just wanted to clarify that. So I don't want to mislead our viewers.
Okay. And before we move on and introduce our visiting journalist, let me just give the audience an update. If you've been listening to our podcast, you know that Mr. Fakler is a New York Jets fan. He came out a few weeks ago and talked about how Aaron Rodgers, the soon-to-be Hall of Fame quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, had been traded to the New York Jets. I am a Miami Dolphins fan. Most of the people watching this podcast are probably pulling for the Miami Dolphins, which is the home team. Well, we are 3 weeks into it, and no Aaron Rodgers going to the Green Bay Packers yet. We will continue to update you week after week after week until ultimately Mr. Fakler's breaking news of Aaron Rodgers going to the New York Jets, which happens to be one of the biggest rivals for the Miami Dolphins. So we'll keep you updated on that. And then finally, who else do we have on this podcast today? We have a gentleman who's been a journalist for 20 years. He's also an author. He has published a variety of different books. He writes about real estate. He's written about banking, basically anything and everything breaking news in South Florida, business as it comes down the pike. It's going to be written by Brian Bandell. Brian works over at the South Florida Business Journal. And if you want to check out his books, you want to buy any of them, bypass Amazon, buy from him directly, go to brianbandell.com. That being said, what's going on, Brian? How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Still making a living as a journalist.
you're still doing it and you're still out there grinding, and everybody's appreciative for the fact that you are still busting balls. And this is a podcast that permits salty language, so don't worry about language.
Well,
Some of the others
there's no
might.
cursing in the newsroom, as you know. It's always very nice in there, very polite.
Yes. Fantastic. We're going to go ahead. We're going to take a commercial break. The other side of the break, we're going to get into our first three stories.
It's a simple formula, and it works. Buy low, sell high. We're Condo Vultures, and when it comes to your real estate, we help you buy low. At Condo Vultures, we represent the buyer, and now's the time to buy. Log on to condovultures.com for more information. Condovultures.com. And remember, before you sell high, you have to buy low. Featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, 60 Minutes, and Time Magazine. Condo Vultures Realty, a licensed Florida real estate brokerage capitalizing on the condo correction since 2006.
Welcome back to the Miami Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. We are going to discuss the first three stories that I handpicked. I sent them off to the journalists, asked them to give them a read and go ahead and provide some context to us, just to kind of understand what the significance may be, not only right now today, but also in the future as this real estate world, as well as this U.S. economy, possibly global economy, starts to evolve and start to change. So we're going to start off with Brian Bandell first, and this is a story Brian actually wrote. So, Brian, I'm going to go ahead. I'll read the headline. I'll read the first couple of graphs for the audience, and then I'll just ask you to provide any kind of feedback you can. Now, you wrote the story. You might not feel comfortable commenting, but maybe you can give us some insight that would be valuable for the audience. So, Brian, here's what we got for your headline and for your story. Headline: New condo boom feeds off short-term rentals. In the first couple of graphs, condominiums purposely built for short-term rentals were established in Miami just a few years ago, but they've swiftly become a huge part of the new condo construction boom, capitalizing on the popularity of home sharing services such like Airbnb. Short-term rental condos don't have the typical rental restrictions of most condo buildings in South Florida. They provide a unit owner with the flexibility to rent the condo for as many days a year as they want, or stay there themselves if they feel like it. These projects are a mix between homes, apartments, and hotels, all the discretion of their owners. Brian, why don't you give us some context about this?
Well, I came up with it because a lot of the condos being proposed in Miami, I noticed, were short-term rentals. A lot of these new projects, like a Nomad in Wynwood by Related Group, 600 Miami World Center, we're getting all these different developers coming up with short-term rental product. And in fact, almost half of the new condos proposed in the city of Miami are short-term rental. And again, this is a very new concept. Yotel Pad, which opened earlier this year, was the first short-term rental approved in Miami ever. So, with that done officially this way, so this is a very new product that's getting a tremendous amount of investment, and a lot of them sold out quickly. Like you look at the 11 project, that sold out with, in less than 6 months. And so they're doing more. So I think definitely from the sales perspective, it's doing well, but there's also questions in how successful will they be when they actually open? How good of investment are they? And that's where I tried to kind of get into the weeds and try and figure that out.
Got it. Brian, quick question for the audience. The market's evolved since the 90s, basically when the condo hotel concept came here. And I'm not saying these are condo hotels. These are short-term rentals, but could you just sort of lay out in layman's terms, what would be the difference for the audience between a traditional condo hotel and one of these short-term rentals? Is there much of a difference?
I'd say the biggest difference with short-term rental is flexibility, right? In a condo hotel, the owner is not supposed to live there. The owner basically has to rent it out as a hotel. Maybe if you can stay there, you have to book and reserve your time. When it's not being booked by the hotel, you can't make it your permanent residence. You can't rent it out on a yearly basis. And usually when you rent it, you have to rent it through the company that owns the hotel management platform. A company will own the common area of the hotel, the front desk, and you have to rent it through them and list it through them, basically. And they will set all the rules and they will manage it. Now, in a short-term rental, you can choose to live there if you want. You can make it your full-time permanent residence. Or you can be a snowbird and live there for 6 months and 1 day and move your tax-paying residence from New York to Florida. And when you're not there, rent it out. Or if you choose to rent it, you could rent it for a full year, or you could put it on Airbnb and rent it every day, or you could rent it by month, so it gives you tremendous flexibility. And in most of these buildings, you don't have to rent it through a specific platform. You can usually just kind of pick who rents it. A lot of these buildings, like Hotel Pad, will have on-site management that you can pick if you want. And they will do a lot of this, the checking people in and out and cleaning. There'll be a fee for all that, but you don't have to do it. You can also hire a real estate agent or another company, and they'll manage it for you. So there is more freedom and flexibility, but also, unlike a condo hotel, the prices are not always disclosed up front. So a condo hotel is sold, regulated by the SEC. They kind of have to estimate what our charges are going to be. Short-term rental, because it's not, it's more flexible. They don't really have an answer when I ask, well, how much, if I rent it, how much do I have to pay? How much do I have to pay for the management and for the booking and for the housekeeping? There's not really an answer they can give you. You just kind of have to go into it and find out.
Interesting. Well, that's definitely something we're going to keep an eye on. What we're also going to keep an eye on is this potential banking crisis that's going on in the United States, possibly even the world. We talked before about Silvergate, which is a crypto bank. We also talked about Silicon Valley Bank. We talked about Credit Suisse. Last week, there was a situation with Deutsche Bank out of Germany. So, Jean, I want to go to you with this story. This is going to come out of CNBC. I will read you the headline. I'll read you the first, or I guess the 3 key points that CNBC has identified. And then, John, I'll ask you to provide some insight, if you will. Headline: this is not another banking crisis. Analyst says it's sentiment contagion instead. And here's the 3 points, Sean. Point number 1, the collapse of U.S.-based Silicon Valley Bank, the biggest bank failure since the global financial crisis, sparked a sell-off in banking stocks as contagion fear spread. Point number 2, the S&P 500 index climbed 3% on Monday, or remains down nearly 23% over March, while in Europe, the stock 600 bank index closed 1.7% higher on Monday, but has shed more than 17% this month. And point number 3, Jean, Citi concluded that in the absence of a clear explanation for Friday's stock prices moves, we are in an irrational market. John, what do you make of that? Is there really a problem with the balance sheets of these institutions, whether it be in the United States or it be in Europe or possibly even in Asia? Or is this simply a situation where people have battle scars from the Great Recession back in 2008 when Lehman Brothers failed and we were on the brink of the global financial system going sideways? So what's your take on it, John?
Well, I think the latest round of banking troubles just exposes poorly managed banks, banks that have been struggling, banks that haven't managed their balance sheet appropriately, basically bad bankers. And the honest truth is that the rapid increase in interest rates is exposing the less well-managed banks. And so the fact of the matter is good banks are well capitalized. Good banks have managed their balance sheets correctly because it's been a year since the Fed has telegraphed basically that they're raising rates. So these banks should have, most banks have hedged their positions and created a situation where they are not in the predicament that the Silicon Valley Bank found itself in. And the fact of the matter is that the banking institutions are in much better shape now than they were in 2008. Now, of course, you can't, if you get a run on the bank and like mass panic, that's a completely different issue. And there's not a whole lot that banks can do without the help of the federal government coming in and saying, "Hey, we're gonna make sure that we keep the financial system stable." So, I mean, it's really multiple issues, but I think the recent rise in interest rates has exposed the poorly managed banks. I mean, Credit Suisse, Silicon Valley Bank. I mean, all these banks. Basically poorly managed, a bunch of scandals and problem assets. And those are going to get exposed when the tide goes out, basically.
Yes, they are. And yes, they have. It's been very interesting. We're going to go, John Fakler, we're going to go to you with story number 3. Story number 3 is actually coming out of the ABC affiliate down here in South Florida. It's called WPLG. It's Channel 10. and the website is local10.com. John, you have evolved as our spring break expert over the years that we've been doing this podcast. Let me read you the headline. Let me read you the first couple graphs. Headline: Miami Beach city officials taking steps now to cancel spring break in 2024. So a year from now. First couple graphs. Spring break on Miami Beach could look very different in the years to come. The city's trying to get ahead of spring break crowds after a violent and deadly bout this year. Mayor Dan Gelbert said during a commission meeting on Monday that he wants to make Miami Beach a less attractive destination for spring break partier. A violent spring break put Miami Beach on a national stage. John, give us some idea about what the mayor's trying to do, why he's doing it, and if you can, because you've been here since the 80s, can you compare and contrast what Fort Lauderdale, which at a time was a legendary spring break destination, and ultimately turned towards more arts and a higher price clientele, if you will. So could you lay that out for the audience?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on right now. One of these is sort of a PR move by him. He's trying to put out the changes that will be coming over the next few years. He wants it out in the media so that spring breakers will avoid coming here. That includes shutting down liquor sales. It includes having a curfew on South Beach, which is huge. It's also including having a private ticketed venues during the spring break weeks where people have to pay to get in. There'll be metal detectors. So it's going to be in the Ocean Drive. They haven't pinned it down, but it's going to be in the Ocean Drive area. So this way, it keeps people off the street, it keeps crime down. But, to me that, logistically, it just doesn't really make sense. I think the whole idea here is just to thwart people from coming here, doing whatever they can to do that. And, there's also some issues too in the story. They talked about the liquor sales and they tabled that as far as the commission meeting. So I was wondering why that happened. And apparently there's a bill out there, I know Brian knows about this, where it's going to make any single business that wants to sue the government, sue the city, will kill whatever ordinance that's in place, which is kind of crazy because one single business can do this. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but this includes Big Sugar, all the other businesses in Florida. But in this case, the only reason why Miami Beach is skirting this is because, in the case of an emergency exemption, they're exempted in case of an emergency. Miami Beach had a problem with South Beach with the rioters, and so they got an exemption. But this preemptive bill is automatic, and it's interesting. Even though the Miami Beach situation, they skirted that and they were able to impose an ordinance.
Yeah,
they can still be sued
it started
down the road.
They capped
The only thing that
at 2 a.m. at the South 5th neighborhood, and Jeffrey Soper's nightclub filed suit, and
that's right.
And they're fighting over that. And now they're trying to stop liquor sales for the liquor stores. But this bill proposed in the Florida legislature would basically say that if a local government, not a state government, because the state can do whatever it wants, but if the local government passes a bill that hurts a company's business revenue, the business can sue, preempt the bill, and try and get damages. So if they try and stop the liquor store from selling liquor at all hours of the night, the liquor store can argue, well, you're hurting my business. If they try and do a curfew, the nightclubs can try and argue, well, you're hurting my business. So all these different companies that could try and make that argument that, no, you're shutting me down. So we'll start getting into the weeds of will they even be allowed to do this kind of regulation?
Yeah, exactly. We got into this a little bit last week. Remember, we were talking about this very issue. And so it's going to be interesting how this, goes forward. I believe that the reason they tabled the liquor store sales because there's an actual lawsuit. One of the liquor stores sued them, and it got into a big to-do and last week. And then all of a sudden you have this bill being proposed, which looks like it might actually pass because it's already in the executive committee, or I should say the regulatory committee. And yeah, so with this legislation, you have the Democrats and the Republicans fighting tooth and nail, really going at it. The Republicans being pro-business, Democrats are trying to, protect their government ordinances.
Local control. I mean, the people of Miami Beach have elected these commissioners. And the commissioners campaigned on these issues. They want to calm things down to have less violence in their community. So the question is, will we let the local people speak and have their voice and make decisions, or are we just going to, not allow that to happen and have the state dictate everything that happens all over the place? So that's the issue here. And, you could say maybe it's true for some businesses, but it's not great for every business. Believe me, it's not great for all the retailers on Lincoln Road to have this kind of chaos going on. I don't think they're all that happy to it.
Great point, Brian. Great point. Okay, guys, let's go ahead. We'll take a commercial break. Other side of the break, we'll get into our next three stories. This is Peter Zalewski of the Condo Vultures podcast. I hope you're enjoying the podcast. And I wanted to alert you that if you have a property that you're looking to sell in the Tri-County, South Florida area, I would encourage you to reach out to Jenny Cortez, a licensed real estate broker with CVRrealty.com. She's my partner. She's been in the business for north of 15 years. More importantly, she knows the market. She knows how to get a deal done. And she also realizes that it's more important to get a price that you can accept and sell the property rather than to hold firm on some price that's never going to be achieved and ultimately languish on the market. So if you're looking to do a deal that you want a skilled expert who can help you sell a property, reach out to Jenny Cortez at 305-865-5859, 305-865-5859, or visit her website, cvrrealty.com. Welcome back to the Miami Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. We're going to get into our story number 4. Mr. Fakler, we're going to go back to you with this particular story. You sort of become our crimes beat journalist, if you will. I want to get your perspective. And let me set the context before I get into the headline and I get into the story. We have a lot of people who've moved to South Florida. It's been well documented. People coming from New York, coming from California, chasing the dream, chasing the lifestyle. A lot of times, some of the things you overlook when you come down here is that you're going to be able to do stuff the same way you did it back home when you get down here in South Florida. One thing people point to all the time is, the food. New Yorkers like to say, well, the water's not the same in Miami or in South Florida, therefore the bagels aren't the same. The pizza doesn't taste the same. Well, this is a story that's going to be about contractors. These are the people who go in there and they do the work that you want them to do when you buy your dream property. You're going to make it into every single thing you want. Well, here's a tale, Mr. Fakler. I want you to give us some perspective about. Headline, and by the way, it's coming from the Miami Herald. Headline, Fort Lauderdale contractors and victims have been left with pool-sized holes, cops say. First couple graphs. A contractor against whom a condominium association president had a year-long restraining order is accused of leaving a trail of fraud victims and under construction work around Broward County. Police think the trail could be longer. Fort Lauderdale's Richard Stubblefield, 56, was arrested Wednesday at his probation officer's office. Stubblefield faces charges of grand theft between $5,000 to $10,000, grand theft between $10,000 to $20,000, grand theft between $20,000 and $100,000, obtaining property under $20,000 by fraud, and obtaining property over $20,000 by. His bond on those charges add up to $82,500, but the no bond on the violation of probation charges adds up to him still being in Broward County Jail as of Sunday morning. Wilton Manors police say Stubblefield, through his company, All Pro Pools and Pavers, took folks' money for projects he never completed or didn't even start by applying for the permits. Mr. Fakler, is this an anomaly where a contractor during a go-go period where everybody's coming down here burning cash, trying to make their castle into a castle, and then ultimately skipping town? We've heard about it during hurricane times when you have a lot of contractors that send out an area because everybody's trying to get their life back together. But what about during a luxury type of run-up where, it's the go-go days, everybody's making money? Is this an anomaly, or is this something that happens, or you've seen happen since you've been here those 40 plus years when you came down from New York and you moved to South Florida? What say you, Mr. Fakler?
I would not call it an anomaly. I mean, this is classic South Florida contractor heaven. Come down here, scam people. But you are right. I mean, this is really, you saw more of this during the hurricane season. So this is, as far as during the run up here, during the luxury period, perhaps it is an anomaly, but I mean, this guy was, he was off his rocker. This guy, he actually got arrested at his probation offices because he was on probation for a year. And the reason he was on probation, and don't forget this restraining order that you mentioned, that was against filed by the condo president. The condo president, apparently this guy was hanging around with his friends. His old office used to be in his condo building. So they were drinking, they were hanging out. The guy pulled a gun, started flashing it. And it's a handgun, and it's in front of like 10 people and a king order. All hell breaks loose. The guy goes to jail. And, in the meantime, this guy had a dozen contracts, at least a dozen. They're still looking at other contracts that were unfulfilled. Half of them, he didn't even pull a permit, and he was getting paid. So he escaped with everybody's money. He absconded with everybody's cash, didn't do the work. People got holes in their backyards where the pool's supposed to go. And, this is, it's a story that doesn't surprise me because, like you mentioned, we saw these kind of stories during the hurricane seasons, when there were construction issues and problems and all kinds of scammers, contractors scamming everybody. But to see this now, in a way, it is an anomaly. I haven't really heard a story like this, in recent times.
Interesting. And for anybody out there, if you are getting work done and you work with a contractor who's licensed in the state of Florida, you should check with your attorney. But generally speaking, a contractor has the ability to cloud your title. So if you don't pay that contractor, they have the ability to jam you up. So if you were to try to sell the property, if they got a loan against it, and check with your attorney or check with your banker, they can basically put a cloud on that particular title. So I just thought that was an interesting story to sort of consider. Now for story number 5, John, we're going to go to you. This story is coming out of the Commercial Observer. And let me read you the headline and the first couple graphs. Headline: Florida Legislature approves Affordable Housing Live Local Act. That's what the act is called. And here's the first couple graphs, Sean, and then I'll ask you to comment. After 2 years of soaring rents, the Florida Legislature passed a sweeping affordability housing bill with $711 million to fund development programs, incentives for developments, and bans on rent control. The House voted almost unanimously 103-6 to pass the bill called the Live Local Act on Friday. The vote came after the Senate approved the legislation earlier this month. The bill will now go to Governor Ron DeSantis, who's expected to sign it into law. And there's a quote: Floridians are ready to live local and spend less time commuting and more time raising their families in the heart of the communities they serve. Senate President Kathleen Passidomo, who spearheaded the bill, said in a statement, the act would exempt developments constructed in the last 5 years from property taxes for each unit targeted as low and middle income families if the property has at least 70 units that offer rents at least 10% below market rate. Another provision would allow municipalities and counties to spare property taxes for owners who allocate units for those earning 50% or less of the area's median income. John, is this going to save renters, or is this basically a cash cow spigot for the developers?
Well, actually, it's damage control, because what we saw last year was we saw cities like Orlando and St. Petersburg and some other places that started discussing rent control. And I think a lot of people started freaking out about it because they thought, we're gonna turn into like New York City, where they got rent control, and other cities that have this rent control that creates a mess. And I think what it did was it sounded alarms in Tallahassee, and they realized they got a big problem. They can't have a bunch of municipalities instituting rent control and turning Florida into New York. So what happened, I think, is damage control. So let's give a bunch of incentives and, a couple $1 million here and there. I don't know, $700 million. It sounds like a lot, but I mean, to be honest, I'm not quite sure it makes much of a dent. I'm not really persuaded that it's going to make a real big difference in affordable housing. I mean, the affordable housing crisis, we had a similar one in 2005. It was huge. People couldn't afford to rent a home. It was a crazy housing market, just like it is now. And I think government, this was sort of an olive branch to the communities that are considering passing rent control. And now the state has banned rent control. So, they got what they wanted, and, this is not going to turn into like a bunch of communities instituting rent control like they do in New York City. So that's my opinion on that whole situation.
Interesting. All right. Brian, we're going to go to you with story number 6. This is a story you wrote. This is actually a story that John has been referencing, the concept for the last few So Brian, you wrote this story. I'll read the headline and the first couple graphs for the audience. Headline: South Florida commercial real estate sales plummet 55%, 55 in Q4. And here's the first couple graphs. It was a rough fourth quarter for commercial real estate brokers in South Florida, and property sales plunged 55% compared to a year ago, according to property data from Visda. Am I saying that right, Brian?
Yeah.
Visda. All right. There were $5.2 billion in commercial real estate sales of at least $1 million each in the Tri-County region, down from $11.6 billion in the same quarter a year ago. Number of transactions fell 40% to 631. The average price of each deal also fell. Brian, why did the number of real estate deals, commercial real estate deals, fall or slow? And what's the outlook going forward based on the reporting you did?
The main reason is higher interest rates. And interest rates impact deals in a couple of ways. One, they make financing more expensive. So if you want to get that mortgage, it costs more. The property costs more. That impacts the cap rates. So basically, they look at the profitability of the property and the return you would get from it versus the value. So if the mortgage rate is higher, that's reducing your profitability. That's depressing prices automatically. And then, so what that also does is that makes a buyer and seller disagreement on price. So the sellers say, I want the same prices from mid 2022. And the buyers are saying, look, that price does not exist anymore, man. Interest rates have doubled since then. I can't pay you what you could have gotten then. I have to pay you a little less now. And a lot of the sellers are not having it. And part of the problem is interest rates are not done rising. The Fed continues raising rates. So if you're a buyer, you don't know what the rates are going to settle at. A lot of these are adjustable rate loans, right? So you might say, well, I can afford this building at a 6% loan. But what happens if the Fed raises rates and now it's a 7% loan or an 8% loan? Then I don't know if I can afford this building. I don't know if this is a good deal anymore. So until you kind of know that they're done raising rates, it's kind of hard to do that. And then the other side is a lot of the banks are getting much more conservative in lending. A lot of the big banks have more regulation coming down on them. They're concerned about growing. And also, banks are afraid of making loans at too low of a rate. Silicon Valley got into trouble because it had bonds and treasuries at too low of a rate. But you could also get in trouble with loans too low. So if you have all these loans in the books at 5%, and now people are making loans at 7%, those loans at 5% are not worth as much. They're not as valuable. They might still be printing an income, but they're not as good. And especially if they're like to real estate, like office buildings and stuff like that people have questions about. So what all this has led to is a lot of commercial real estate brokers are taking extended vacations right now. They're not closing deals, and the number of real estate transaction stories is way down because the transactions are way down. There's just not as much being traded right now.
And Brian, just and then I'll go to John in case John wants to comment. But Brian, how do you get a seller to have a religious moment when they start to realize maybe everything they believed based on the price they paid, maybe at the peak when things were going up, isn't necessarily what the price is today? Is there what have you seen, or what did people say as to how do you get a seller to back off from a hard and a high asking price?
I think a lot of it depends on the motivation of the seller and the timing, right? So some people are like families that have owned the property for 20 years, and they're like, look, why would I sell when things are on the down trajectory, right? Okay, I missed the peak. That sucks. I'll wait 5 years. I'm not in a rush, right? But then there's other people, for whatever reason, they have to sell. Maybe their mortgage is running out. I need to refinance. And they're like, damn, I can't refinance. The bank isn't going to let me. Or if I refinance into a loan that's 7% instead of 3.5%, I'd rather just sell the thing. And you probably could sell it for a gain, just not as much of a gain as you would have gotten, a year ago. So you'll just have to do it like that. But if you're still, I think you'll be okay. It's just a lot of it is what is the motivation that will force, is there a reason that you have to sell now? If there's not a reason to sell now, I think a lot of them are saying, look, I don't know why I would want to sell now when there's kind of panic in the market, when the buyers are kind of lowballing me on this, maybe I'll wait for a better time. Now, the disadvantage is if you wait, interest rates can get higher, which makes the cap rate worse, which makes the buyer have an even more expensive loan. So your price might go down more. So waiting may not necessarily help. You need to decide if I'm going to wait, if I'm going to wait, I might be willing to wait a long time. Because I don't know if we're ever going to see 3.5% rates again, right? I can't predict if that's ever going to happen.
Right.
So you might have to bite the bullet now if you really want to sell.
Great point. Great point. Jean, can you chime in? And
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in like mark to market. What are the banks going to have to do if the fact of prices can't be substantiated? And then if they do need to adjust their portfolio and basically ask for more money from the borrower? I'm just wondering if you might be able to provide some context related to that.
Yeah. And I was going to mention that in the prediction section, but what I wanted to mention was, that if you put yourself in the shoes of an investor, investors are looking at alternatives for their money. So should I put my money in a commercial real estate property that yields 5%? Or can I go and buy some treasury bonds and bills and get a yield that's pretty close to that, that's like completely 100% safe? Or, so as an alternative. So now that interest rates have risen, I can get like 4 or 5% on government-backed or government securities that are pretty safe, instead of putting it in commercial real estate with the same returns, but much more uncertainty, like taxes going up, insurance. Are my tenants all going to leave? I got to upgrade the property, blah, 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 all kinds of uncertainties and risks. Or do I put my money in like safe treasuries, which actually provide a decent return now? And I think a lot of investors are saying, you know what, I'm not going to accept a 5% cap rate when I can like basically get the same return on a risk-free treasuries. So, what's the appeal? So, I mean, what has to happen is commercial real estate values have to drop so that those cap rates go up and make it appealing for buyers. And I think that's where we are now. And of course, they're not willing to accept that. So there's probably a huge spread between buyers and sellers now for that very reason. I mean, the commercial real estate lending and banks and institutions, I mean, the banks haven't yet realized, that they might be, they might have some problem assets in the commercial real estate area. And that, there's usually a lag time because part of the problem is like a lot of sales aren't happening. So there's not a lot of comps, and it's hard to value commercial real estate when you don't have a lot of comps. And certainly they don't want to take a hit, with their commercial real estate lending portfolio. So they're going to hold off as long as they can. So, I mean, I don't think we're going to have issues this year with commercial real estate loans going bad, but it could be a problem in the next couple, 2-3 years.
Fascinating story, Brian, and great context, John, as well. So, guys, let's go ahead. We'll take a commercial break. On the side of the break, I'm going to ask the journalists to provide some words of wisdom for you, the audience, whether you've been here in South Florida quite some time or you're a new arrival. So we'll be right back. This is Peter Zalewski of the Condo Vultures podcast. Before I started doing these podcasts, I was in the business of being a licensed real estate broker, a contributing columnist for the Miami Herald, as well as the Miami Real Deal, but also extra witness work in consulting. So if you are looking for an expert witness, or if you're looking for consulting services, a straight talk perspective as to what's going on in a particular marketplace, a building, or what happened previously, for whatever your situation is, whether you are an attorney, whether you are a institutional fund looking to invest, or whether you're a lender who's trying to come up with some sort of strategy and approach for your lending committee going forward, I just might be able to help you. To get a hold of me, please reach out to Peter@condovultures.com. That's Peter@condovultures.com, or give me a call to the office at 305-865-5859, 305-865-5859. Welcome back to the Miami Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. We discussed 6 articles that I handpicked. I asked journalists to provide some context, and I think they provided some pretty interesting insight. Now, what I want to do before we wrap up this podcast is that to each of them for some words of wisdom, if you will. So doesn't matter if you've been down here in South Florida for quite some time or if you're a new arrival. We have a changing market conditions. We're entering the second quarter of 2023. Federal Reserve is still raising interest rates. There's a possible banking crisis out there, and it's basically some unsettling times. And who better to ask than people who've kind of been through the war, if you will. So I'm going to go one by one. I'll ask each of them to provide some words of wisdom, and then we will wrap up this podcast. So, John, why don't we start with you? John, what would you say would be your words of wisdom as we get ready to enter into the second quarter of 2023?
Yeah, I want to just mention the banking crisis a little more and its impact on South Florida specifically, because I think that the tightening credit conditions are going to filter down to community banks and regional banks in South Florida, and they're the heart and soul of commercial real estate lending. Community banks historically have been a huge source of commercial real estate lending to small businesses. And, what happens on the national level, whether even global level, Credit Suisse or Silicon Valley Bank, the fact of the matter is that regulators, and everybody's talking about commercial real estate now as perhaps being the next shoe to drop. Who knows? But you can believe that the regulators are going to be taking a close look at every bank's commercial real estate portfolio. And really, that's the bread and butter of community banking in South Florida. And I think that is going to put a chill on lending to small businesses. And I think we're going to have some tightening conditions. And this is not good for our growing economy, because this is a source of funds that will help small businesses expand. So really, it's a bit disconcerting, because we've seen this before. We saw it, during the great financial crisis. A lot of the community banks and the regional banks just quit lending because they had problem loans. They had regulators breathing down their backs, and it just creates very difficult conditions for small businesses, especially those that need capital to grow. So I would just be aware of that, and if you're a business owner or a small business owner, I'd really be watching that carefully and establishing lines of credit that you might need. Just be sure you're prepared for that kind of environment.
Fascinating. Brian Bandell, why don't you provide some words of wisdom?
I think something big to watch is loan maturities, especially in the office sector. As John said, a lot of banks are going to be hesitant to lend, right? They're especially hesitant to loan to office buildings because they're not really sure what's going to happen with remote work. They're concerned that as leases expire, tenants are going to take less space. They're going to go to hybrid arrangements. And even with some companies coming here, the offices that aren't like on Brickell Avenue in Miami Beach, those offices could be in tough shape. So as these loans mature, there'll be fewer banks that will want to take the loans and write new credit. And the borrowers are going to be looking at trying to afford an interest rate that's a lot higher than the rate that they signed 5 years ago. So there will be some opportunities for investors here to either maybe buy the expiring loans and work something out, maybe buy the properties and decide to re-tenant them, maybe even redevelop them in some cases. But I definitely think that is an area to watch.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, great context. Mr. Fakler, why don't you provide some great context for us, for our audience?
Okay, this really relates to the Herald story we were talking about before, and you had mentioned, listen, before anybody moving to the area, and I would actually say anybody who lives here as well, whether they're moving here, relocating, or they live here already, is before you get any contractor work done, hire a lawyer, do your due diligence. You don't want to be caught holding the bag. We talked about this earlier, that perhaps we saw more of this during the hurricane construction problems back in the day. But if we don't know if this is a trend as far as these contractors running amok again. But so just be real careful before you do any purchasing, before you do any home improvements.
Some great context. And for my words of wisdom, the question I'm always getting is it going to become a buyer's market in South Florida for condominiums? What I can tell you right now is when I post anything on social media, I always get a pushback saying it's a seller's market. If you look at the months of supply, we're coming in all of the major markets in the Tri-County, South Florida area. We're coming in with less than 6 months of supply, which is typically the rule of thumb for equilibrium. However, what we are seeing is the number of days is doubling. So what that means is in 2022, it might have taken X number of days in order to list a property, go under contract, and ultimately close it. Now, the days that the property is sitting on the market is more than twice as much as it was in 2022. And we are in March. Our traditional winter buying season goes from, let's call it November through April, basically when it's good weather. When the weather starts to get hot and humid, it's 90 degrees by 9 a.m., 90% humidity. You don't have as many people coming here. You might get some deals done by locals, but you don't really get the same out of town deals. So really what we're looking at is kind of one of these moments where sellers who've overpaid, they are handcuffed to low interest rates, are now trying to figure out what are they going to do. And then you have to ask yourself, if they decide they're going to rent them, how are they going to compete against maybe some of these short-term rentals, and as well as some of these people who are maybe in Latin America or overseas who basically need to generate some revenue? Because remember, fees are going up on condo maintenance, as well as insurance costs. I made a comment a couple of weeks ago talking about how somebody owned a duplex. Their insurance price was $12,000 a year, or basically, $1,000 per month for 2 units. So that's $500 each. That $12,000 insurance bill went up to $60,000. Guy tried to sell it and all the prices came in, factoring in that much higher insurance price. So a lot of pressure on pricing. And the question is, will the rents be able to basically substantiate and support anybody who can't necessarily live in that place or had the strategy to rent it out? So I think that will be the push-pull in addition to the adjusting interest rates. Because many investors, that when they buy property, they buy with adjustable rate mortgages. So I will tell you, probably by the time we get to the end of this year, I would look for a much softer market. I don't know if it'll be a full-fledged buyer's market based strictly on months of supply, but I think the most important indicator to watch today is not months of supply, but more so days on market. That's more of a real-time sentiment sort of gauge rather than months of supply, because you got some people sitting back saying, I paid this is what I want back. And I'm not sure they're ever going to get it back. So let me go ahead and thank our panelists. I want to thank John Gruss. John was a journalist for 25 years. Now he has a public relations and marketing firm called Gruss Communications. If you want to get a hold of him, reach out to him at grusspr.com. That's GRUSSPR.com. Also want to thank Brian Bandell. Brian's been a journalist for 20 years. He's also an author. If you want to check out any of his books, go to brianbandell.com, or you can hit him up on Twitter where it's at Brian Bandell. And I also want to thank John Fakler. John was a journalist for 20 years. Right now he does public relations and consulting related to that. If you want to get a hold of John, send him an email at fakler@consultant.com, FAKLER@consultant, which is singular.com. And I'm Peter Zalewski. Let me remind you, if you want to send us an email, you want to ask a question, you want to comment, send an email to inquiry@condovultures.com. That's IAQUIRY@condovultures.com. And don't forget, you can actually watch this podcast if you go to any platform that provides for video. And if you want to check us out on YouTube, the handle is Condo Vultures TV. And until next time, take care of yourself. We'll catch up soon. Ciao, ciao.
Don't buy a South Florida condo, discounted or distressed, before taking a Condo Vultures correction tour. CondoVultures.com offers weekly bus and walking tours that focus on educating buyers on the how-tos of identifying discounted condos, analyzing the opportunities, and purchasing units. Every tour attendee receives a list of all condo projects in a particular market, a market assessment handout, and unmatched expert analysis. For more information on the condo correction tours, please visit condovultures.eventbrite.com.